A restaurant manager slaps a black elderly woman in front of everyone, thinking she can just walk away. But what she doesn't know, what no one knows, is that the woman she hit is the mother of a Hells Angels leader. Within hours, the video goes viral. Her job's gone, the town's furious, and somewhere on a roaring highway, an army of bikers is coming. But when the sun arrives, the story takes a turn no one could have imagined. Because instead of revenge, his mother, frail and kind, asks for something the world's forgotten. Forgiveness. Now the whole town's watching. Will fury win, or will grace rewrite everything? And when love and vengeance meet face to face, who will walk away changed forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Betty's diner, casting warm, golden squares across the weathered linoleum floor. The familiar chime of the bell above the door announced each new customer, mixing with the soft twang of Patsy Cline from the old jukebox in the corner. The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon wrapped around the cozy space like a comfortable blanket. Betty Langston stood behind the counter, her gray hair neatly pinned back, greeting her Sunday regulars with the same warm smile she'd worn for the past 30 years. "Morning, Tom. The usual?" she called out, already reaching for a coffee mug. The diner hummed with the gentle buzz of conversation and the clink of silverware against plates. When Ethel Washington stepped through the door, several heads turned to offer friendly nods. Her powder blue church hat sat perfectly atop her silver hair, and she clutched her well-worn Bible close to her chest. The morning light caught the cross pinned to her collar, making it sparkle. "Good morning, Betty," Ethel said, her voice as gentle as a spring breeze. She made her way to her usual spot, the third booth from the door, where the sunlight warmed her arthritis-stiff fingers just right. Behind the counter, Samantha Reeves darted between the grill and the prep station, her face pinched with stress. Her dark hair was coming loose from its tight bun, and sweat beaded on her forehead. She'd been at Betty's for only 2 weeks, but the transition from Atlanta's fast-paced restaurants to this small-town diner hadn't been the easy switch she'd expected. "Order up," she called sharply, pushing plates toward the teenage waitress, who seemed to be moving too slowly for Samantha's city-trained pace. Her daughter's daycare bills were due tomorrow, and she couldn't afford any mistakes today. Ethel settled into her booth, placing her Bible carefully beside her. When her place setting arrived, she noticed the fork had dried egg stuck between the tines. With the patience of someone who'd spent 40 years soothing worried patients, she caught Samantha's eye as she passed. "Excuse me, dear," Ethel said softly. "I hate to trouble you, but might I have a clean fork?" Samantha spun around, 3 plates balanced precariously on her arms. The morning rush was hitting its peak, the kitchen ticket rail was full, and now this. Her temples throbbed with the beginning of a headache. "What's wrong with that one?" she snapped, not even trying to hide her irritation. "It just needs a quick wash, that's all," Ethel explained, still smiling kindly. "No hurry at all." Something in Ethel's calm demeanor, perhaps the gentle understanding in her eyes, or the peaceful way she sat there, made something snap inside Samantha. All the pressure of the past months, the move from Atlanta, the struggle to make ends meet, the judgmental looks from some of the townspeople, boiled over in one terrible moment. Before anyone could react, Samantha's hand flew out, connecting with Ethel's cheek with a crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent diner. Ethel's hat tumbled to the floor, rolling like a dropped coin before settling under a nearby table. The silence that followed was deafening. The jukebox had coincidentally hit a gap between songs, making the moment even more stark. Forks stopped midway to mouths, coffee cups froze halfway to lips, Even the sizzle of the grill seemed muted. A teenage boy in the corner, wide-eyed behind his thick-rimmed glasses, held up his phone, its camera pointed directly at the scene. The red recording light blinked steadily. Betty stood frozen behind the counter, one hand pressed to her mouth, horror written across her face. The teenage waitress had dropped her empty serving tray, the clatter still resonating through the stunned silence. Ethel's hand moved slowly to her cheek, where a red mark was already forming. But her eyes, when they met Samantha's, held no anger, only a deep, sorrowful understanding that made Samantha take a step back. With deliberate movements, Ethel reached down and retrieved her hat. She smoothed it carefully, placed it back on her head, and gathered her Bible. Standing up, she straightened her spine with dignity that seemed to fill the entire diner. Looking directly at Samantha, whose face had drained of all color as the reality of what she'd done sank in, Ethel spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the silence. "God forgive you, child." The words weren't bitter or angry. They were a genuine prayer, spoken with sincere concern. Then Ethel turned and walked toward the door. Her steps were measured and steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the door open. The bell chimed cheerfully, incongruous with the heavy atmosphere. Outside in the bright Sunday morning sunshine, Ethel paused on the sidewalk. Her cheek stung, but it was her heart that ached, not for herself, but for the troubled young woman whose eyes had held such pain and fear. She gripped her Bible tighter and closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. "Lord," she whispered, "give me strength, and please help that poor child find peace." A gentle breeze stirred her skirt, carrying the scent of nearby magnolia blossoms. Inside the diner, the world was about to explode into chaos, but out here, Ethel stood quietly in the morning sun, unaware that her response to violence with grace would soon ripple far beyond the boundaries of their small town. For now, she simply prayed, her faith as steady as the morning sun warming her face. The red mark on her cheek throbbed gently, a reminder of human frailty and the constant choice between hatred and love. Her heart was heavy, but her spirit remained unbroken. In all her 76 years, she had learned that sometimes the hardest moments were the ones that led to the most profound changes. But those changes were still to come. And for now, she simply stood there, letting the peace of her faith wash over her like the warm Georgia sunshine. By late afternoon, the morning's shocking incident at Betty's diner had spread far beyond the small town of Ridgeville. The teenage boy's shaky cell phone video, initially shared on social media with a few friends, exploded across platforms with the inflammatory headline, "Manager slaps elderly black woman in Georgia diner." The video showed the scene in stark clarity: Ethel's polite request, Samantha's sudden violent reaction, and most powerfully, Ethel's dignified exit. Comments flooded in by the thousands, each viewer taking sides in a debate that was rapidly dividing the community. Outside Betty's diner, a crowd began gathering as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Some carried hastily made signs reading, "Justice for Ethel," and "Stop the Hate." Across the street, a smaller group of counter-protesters defended Samantha, their voices growing louder as they argued that the whole thing was being blown out of proportion. "She was just having a bad day," one woman shouted, her face red with anger. "That old lady was being difficult on purpose." "A bad day doesn't justify assault," came the response from across the street. Inside her small two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, Samantha Reeves sat on her worn couch, staring at her phone in horror. The video had already reached over 100,000 views. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the comments. "She should be in jail. Racist! How dare she hit a sweet old lady!" Earlier that day, Betty herself had called, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You're fired, Samantha. I can't have someone like that managing my diner. Don't bother coming in tomorrow." As if that wasn't enough, her landlord had left a stern voicemail about her overdue rent. "2 months behind is 2 months too many, Ms. Reeves. Either pay up by the end of the week or we'll have to start the eviction process." A small voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. "Mommy, why are people yelling outside?" Samantha looked up to see her 8-year-old daughter, Lily, standing in the doorway of their living room, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Through their thin walls, they could hear the faint sounds of protesters who had discovered where she lived. "Come here, baby," Samantha said, patting the couch beside her. Lily climbed up, her big brown eyes full of confusion and concern. "Tommy at the playground said you hurt someone," Lily whispered. "He said his mom saw it on Facebook. Did you really hurt that lady, Mommy?" Samantha's throat tightened. How could she explain this to her daughter? How could she justify something she herself couldn't understand? I didn't mean to," she started, but the words felt hollow. Lily's lower lip trembled. "But you did hurt her, didn't you?" Tears spilled down Samantha's cheeks as she nodded slowly. "Yes, baby. I did something very wrong today. I lost my temper and hurt someone who didn't deserve it. And now—" She gestured helplessly at her phone, where another hateful comment appeared. Across town, in her modest home filled with photographs and memories, Ethel Washington sat in her favorite armchair, her phone buzzing constantly on the side table. She had stopped answering it hours ago, overwhelmed by the calls from reporters, concerned neighbors, and distant relatives who had seen the video. Pastor John Everett sat across from her, his kind face creased with worry. "Sister Ethel, are you sure you won't press charges? What she did was assault, plain and simple." Ethel shook her head, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "Vengeance belongs to the Lord," she said softly, her voice steady despite the fading mark on her cheek. "That young woman doesn't need more punishment. She needs prayer." "But the community is up in arms," Pastor Everett insisted. "People want justice." "Sometimes the hardest kind of justice is mercy," Ethel replied, reaching for her well-worn Bible. "That girl has a child to raise and bills to pay. Adding legal troubles won't heal what's broken in her heart." The pastor sighed, knowing better than to argue when Ethel had made up her mind. "You're a better Christian than most, Sister Ethel." After he left, Ethel sat in the growing darkness, watching the evening news coverage of the protests through her window. The reporter's voice droned on about racial tensions and community division, but Ethel's mind was elsewhere. She thought about the fear she'd seen in Samantha's eyes after the slap. Not fear of consequences, but a deeper fear, the kind that makes people lash out at the world. She thought about the child she'd seen in photos at the diner, the daughter Samantha worked so hard to support. Before retiring to bed, Ethel knelt beside her bed as she had done every night for decades. "Dear Lord," she prayed, her soft voice filling the quiet room, "please watch over Samantha Reeves tonight. Help her find peace in her troubled heart. Protect her little girl from the hatred swirling around them. Show them both your love and mercy." Meanwhile, in her apartment, Samantha continued scrolling through the endless comments, each one a fresh wound to her conscience. Lily had fallen asleep beside her, tear tracks still visible on her small face. "I did mean to," Samantha whispered to herself, finally admitting the truth she'd been avoiding all day. "I was angry and frustrated, and I took it out on an innocent woman." The realization brought fresh tears to her eyes as she gently stroked her daughter's hair. Outside, the protesters' voices had finally died down, but their signs still stood propped against the building's wall, silent witnesses to a day that had changed everything. The town of Ridgeville had been transformed in less than 24 hours, divided by an act of violence that lasted mere seconds, but would have consequences for days to come. The night settled heavily over the town, but for both Ethel and Samantha, sleep would be long in coming. One woman prayed for peace, while another drowned in regret, connected by a moment neither would ever forget. The Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling clubhouse of the Hells Angels chapter in Birmingham. The air hung thick with the scent of motor oil, cigarette smoke, and the lingering heat of a summer afternoon. Inside the open garage bay, Ricky Diesel Washington hunched over a Harley-Davidson, his massive hands working methodically on the engine. At 42 years old, Diesel cut an imposing figure. His broad shoulders, honed from years in the Marines and a lifetime of physical work, stretched his leather vest tight. Sweat gleamed on his dark skin as he tightened a bolt, lost in the familiar rhythm of mechanical work that always seemed to quiet his mind. "Hey, Diesel," called out Snake, one of his younger club members, waving his phone. "You gotta see this video, man. Some crazy stuff going down in Georgia?" Diesel barely glanced up, focusing on the carburetor. "Unless it's about bikes or business, it can wait." "Trust me, boss," Snake insisted, his voice taking on an unusual edge. "You need to see this." Something in Snake's tone made Diesel straighten up, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Other club members had started gathering around Snake's phone, their faces growing serious as they watched whatever was playing on the small screen. Snake held out the phone, and Diesel took it, squinting at the title. Manager slaps elderly black woman in Georgia diner. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the location. Ridgeville, Georgia, his hometown. The video started playing, and Diesel's world stopped turning. There was his mother, Ethel Washington, standing at the counter of Betty's Diner, a place he remembered from his childhood. He watched in horror as the manager's hand flew across the screen, striking his mother's face. The sound of the slap seemed to echo through his skull. The shop rag dropped from his suddenly lifeless fingers, his mother's hat falling, her quiet dignity as she picked it up, her soft words of forgiveness. It was too much. Something dark and primal rose in his chest, a fury he hadn't felt since his days in combat. "That's your mama, isn't it?" Snake asked quietly, recognizing Ethel from the single photo Diesel kept in his office. Diesel's massive hands clenched into fists. The other club members took an instinctive step back, recognizing the dangerous stillness that had come over their leader. They'd seen that look before, usually right before someone got hurt. "Yeah," Diesel growled, his voice low and deadly. "That's my mama." He hadn't spoken to her in 5 years, not since that last explosive argument about his choices in life. She'd begged him to leave the club, to come back to the church, to be the son she'd raised him to be. He'd refused, proud and angry, telling her she didn't understand the brotherhood he'd found, the purpose it gave him after the Marines. The last thing she'd said to him was that she'd pray for his soul. Now, watching that video, none of that mattered. Every protective instinct he'd ever had came roaring to the surface. "Get the boys together," he ordered, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We're riding to Georgia." The clubhouse erupted into activity. Phones came out, calls were made, bikes were checked. Within an hour, 20 riders had assembled in the parking lot, their chrome gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Diesel stood before them, his presence commanding absolute attention. "Some manager in Georgia thought it was okay to put hands on my mother," he announced, his voice carrying across the lot. "We're gonna ride to Ridgeville and teach her about respect." A chorus of agreement rose from the assembled bikers. They all knew Diesel's code: protect the innocent, avenge the wronged. And if there was one thing the Hells Angels understood, it was family. The sun was setting as they mounted their bikes, painting the sky in shades of blood red and deep purple. The rumble of 20 engines filled the air like thunder, a sound that had struck fear into many hearts over the years. Before kickstarting his own bike, Diesel pulled out his phone. He stared at his mother's number for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the call button. 5 years of silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, he pressed the button, but it went straight to voicemail. Maybe that was better. He wasn't sure what he'd say to her directly. "Mama?" he said after the beep, his deep voice softening slightly. "I saw what she did. I'm coming home." He paused, wanting to say more but finding the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he ended the call and slipped the phone back into his vest. Miles away in Ridgeville, Ethel Washington sat in her darkened living room when her phone buzzed with the voicemail notification. Her hands trembled as she listened to her son's voice for the first time in 5 years. She recognized the tone. It was the same one he'd used as a teenager before getting into fights, the one that meant trouble was coming. "Lord," she whispered, pressing one hand to her heart, "don't let him make the devil proud." She could almost hear the motorcycles in the distance, though she knew it was just her imagination. But soon enough, that sound would be real, and with it would come a reckoning she'd been praying to avoid. Outside her window, the same blood-red sunset that had launched her son's journey cast long shadows across Ridgeville's streets. The town had already been torn apart by one moment of violence. Now, as Diesel and his brothers thundered toward Georgia, Ethel feared what new wounds tomorrow might bring. The sound of her son's voice played again in her mind. "I'm coming home." Such simple words, but they carried the weight of impending storm clouds. Ethel reached for her Bible, opening it to the Psalms as she had done countless times before. She would need its wisdom more than ever in the days to come. 20 motorcycles roared through the gathering darkness, their headlights cutting through the night like angry eyes. At their head, Diesel rode with single-minded purpose, every mile bringing him closer to a confrontation that would either heal old wounds or create new ones that might never mend. Dawn broke over Ridgeville with an unusual rumble. At first, many residents mistook it for an early morning storm, but as the sound grew louder, they realized it was something else entirely: the synchronized roar of motorcycle engines. Mrs. Henderson, who lived on Oak Street, was the first to peek through her lace curtains. The sight made her gasp. A long line of motorcycles, chrome glinting in the early morning sun, rolling down Main Street like an iron tide. At their head rode a massive figure whose broad shoulders seemed to fill the entire street. All across town, people drew their blinds and watched. Some grabbed their phones to record, while others hustled their children away from windows. The thunderous procession wound its way through the sleepy streets until it reached the modest White House on Maple Lane, where Ethel Washington lived. Ethel had been up since before sunrise, as was her habit. She sat in her favorite chair on the porch, Bible open in her lap, when she heard the approaching rumble. Her heart quickened. She knew that sound, knew who it heralded. Still, seeing her son in the flesh after 5 long years made her breath catch in her throat. Ricky Diesel Washington cut an imposing figure as he dismounted his bike. Road dust coated his leather jacket, and his face bore the hard lines of someone who'd ridden through the night, fueled by rage. Behind him, his crew spread out along the street, their bikes forming an intimidating wall of chrome and steel. "Mama," Diesel said, his voice gruff as he climbed the porch steps. Despite his fierce expression, there was something vulnerable in his eyes, the look of a little boy seeking his mother's approval, even as he prepared to defy her. Ethel rose slowly, her Bible clutched to her chest. "Ricky," she answered softly, using his given name. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached up to touch his cheek. You've gotten thinner." For a moment, the hardness in Diesel's face cracked. Then his jaw tightened again as his gaze fell on the faint mark still visible on her cheek where Samantha had struck her. "Mama, you raised me better than to let someone disrespect you like this," he growled, his fists clenching at his sides. "That woman needs to learn a lesson about consequences." Ethel's hand dropped from his face to grip his arm. "No, baby. What she needs is to learn about grace." She opened her Bible, her voice gaining strength as she quoted, "Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good." Romans chapter 12, verse 21. This ain't about scripture, Mama. It's about justice. Justice without mercy is just another word for vengeance, Ricky. Ethel's voice was gentle but firm. "And vengeance belongs to the Lord." For a brief moment, something shifted in Diesel's expression. A flicker of the boy who'd once sat beside her in church, hanging on every word of her Sunday school lessons. But then one of his men revved an engine, and the spell broke. "I love you, Mama," he said, his voice rougher than before. "But I can't let this stand." Across town, Samantha Reeves crouched low in her car, parked behind the supermarket where she'd been trying to find work. Her hands trembled as she watched the news on her phone. Amateur footage of the bikers' arrival was already spreading across local social media. She recognized their leader immediately. His face had been on the evening news years ago when his Hells Angels chapter had been involved in a major drug bust. The knowledge that such a man was now in Ridgeville because of her made her stomach churn with fear. "Please, God," she whispered, though she hadn't prayed in years, "please don't let them find us." She thought of her daughter Lily, safely at school, and fought back tears of panic. As evening approached, dark clouds began gathering over Ridgeville, matching the mounting tension in the air. The bikers had taken up positions around Betty's diner, their very presence enough to send most of the usual dinner crowd scurrying home. They didn't make trouble. They didn't have to. Their silent vigil spoke volumes about what might come. Betty Langston watched from inside her diner, wringing her hands as she observed how the bikers' presence had emptied her parking lot. She'd already lost so much business since the incident. This felt like the final nail in her diner's coffin. On her porch, Ethel sat in her rocking chair, her Bible open but unread in her lap. She watched the storm clouds gathering and felt the weight of impending conflict pressing down on her shoulders. Thunder rumbled in the distance, nature's own warning of what was to come. A few houses down, Mrs. Taylor hurried inside with her laundry, casting nervous glances at the bikers, who'd parked their motorcycles at the end of the street. They weren't doing anything threatening, just sitting there, watching, waiting. But their presence had turned the peaceful neighborhood into something that felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Lightning flashed across the darkening sky, illuminating Ethel's face as she closed her eyes in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing wind, "give me the strength to guide my son back to your path. And Lord, protect that poor woman and her child from the storm that's brewing, both the one in the sky and the one in men's hearts." The thunder rolled again, closer now, as if in answer to her prayer. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pattering on the porch roof above her head. But Ethel didn't move inside. She remained in her chair, praying for peace, while the storm gathered strength around her. In the growing darkness, motorcycle headlights clicked on one by one around Betty's diner, their beams cutting through the rain like searching eyes. The rumble of thunder mixed with the occasional rev of engines, creating a symphony of impending trouble that echoed through Ridgeville's streets. The town held its collective breath, caught between the natural storm above and the human storm brewing at street level. Both would break soon enough. It was just a question of which would strike first. The morning dawned gray and heavy. the aftermath of last night's storm leaving puddles scattered across Ridgeville's cracked pavement. Ethel Washington stood in her kitchen, carefully packing grocery bags with fresh fruit, bread, and other essentials. Her movements were deliberate, each item chosen with care. Oranges for vitamin C, whole grain bread for sustenance, peanut butter for protein. She knew exactly where to find Samantha Reeves. Word traveled fast in small towns, and several people had spotted the former diner manager's blue Honda Civic parked behind the Piggly Wiggly, where she and her daughter had been sleeping since losing their apartment. Ethel's joints protested as she carried the heavy bags, but she pressed on, her sensible shoes splashing through puddles. The parking lot was mostly empty this early, save for a few employee cars and one worn-looking Civic parked in the far corner, partially hidden behind the dumpsters. As Ethel approached, she could see movement inside the car, Samantha scrambling to sit up straight, her eyes wide with fear when she recognized who was approaching. Little Lily was still asleep in the back seat, covered with what looked like several layers of clothing instead of proper blankets. Ethel knocked gently on the driver's side window. Samantha stared at her for a long moment, her face a mixture of terror and shame, before slowly rolling down the window. "You need food," Ethel said simply, holding up the grocery bags. Samantha's lips trembled. "Mrs. Washington, I don't—" She couldn't seem to find the words, her voice catching in her throat. "Take them," Ethel insisted gently. "There's enough for both you and your little one." Samantha's composure crumbled. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she accepted the bags with shaking hands. "Why?" she managed to whisper. "After what I did to you." "Because holding on to hurt only hurts the one holding it," Ethel replied. She glanced at the back seat where Lily was beginning to stir. "Would you like to share an orange with me? Sometimes talking is easier with something sweet to share." Samantha nodded, unable to speak through her tears. They stepped out of the car, careful not to wake Lily, and settled on a concrete barrier at the edge of the parking lot. Ethel pulled out 2 oranges, handing one to Samantha. "Forgiveness doesn't excuse what you did," Ethel said quietly as she peeled her orange. "It frees me from it. And maybe, just maybe, it can free you too." Samantha's hands shook so badly she could barely peel her orange. No one's ever—" She took a deep breath. "I was wrong, so terribly wrong. I've been trying to figure out how to apologize, but everything I think of sounds hollow." "Sometimes the simplest words are the truest," Ethel replied. "I'm sorry," Samantha whispered. "I am so sorry." Ethel reached over and squeezed the younger woman's hand. "I know you are, child. I know." They sat in silence for a while, sharing orange segments and watching the morning traffic begin to pick up. Finally, Ethel asked, "Would you mind if I said a prayer?" Samantha shook her head, and Ethel bowed her head. "Lord, we thank you for this morning, for the food we share, and for the chance to heal what's broken. Watch over this mother and her child, guide them through these troubled waters, and help us all find the path to peace. Amen." "Amen," Samantha echoed softly. Meanwhile, across town at the Sunset Motel, tension was building among Diesel's crew. They'd taken over nearly half the rooms, their motorcycles lined up in the parking lot like soldiers ready for battle. "This ain't right," muttered Jake, Switchblade Martinez, pacing the worn carpet of their shared room. "We didn't ride all this way just to sit around while Diesel's mama plays nice with that woman." Several others nodded in agreement. They were men of action, used to solving problems with their fists rather than forgiveness. "Talk won't fix disrespect," growled another biker, cleaning his boots with aggressive strokes. "That video's still out there. People still talking about it. Makes us look weak, letting it slide." The restlessness spread through the group like a virus. their patience wearing thin with each passing hour. They were loyal to Diesel, but they were also proud men who believed in swift justice and clear messages. As evening approached, Ethel made her way home, her body tired, but her spirit lifted by the morning's conversation with Samantha. She'd invited the young mother and Lily to stay in her spare room, but Samantha had declined, still too ashamed to accept such kindness. Baby steps, Ethel reminded herself. Baby steps. The sun was setting as she turned onto her street, casting long shadows across her front yard. She noticed the motorcycles first, 3 of them parked in her driveway, their chrome catching the last rays of daylight. Then she saw him, Diesel, sitting on her porch steps, his massive frame seeming to fill the space. "Mama," he said as she approached, his voice gruff but concerned. "Where you been all day?" "Doing the Lord's work," she replied, climbing the steps slowly. "Heard you were talking to that woman." There was an edge to his voice. "The one who hit you." "I was sharing breakfast and prayer with a troubled soul who needs guidance," Ethel corrected him firmly. Diesel stood, towering over his mother's small frame. "Mama, if you won't let me fight for you, at least let me stand guard. These streets ain't safe no more, especially not for you." Ethel looked up at her son, seeing both the fierce biker he'd become and the sensitive boy he'd once been. "The only battle that needs fighting here is the one for people's hearts, Ricky, and that's not one with fists or threats. Evil only understands one language, Mama." "That's where you're wrong, baby." She reached up to touch his cheek, her small hand against his weathered skin. "Evil understands the language of love least of all. That's what makes it so powerful." Diesel didn't pull away from her touch, but she could feel the tension in his jaw. She knew her son's battle wasn't against flesh and blood, but against the spirits of anger and vengeance that had taken root in his heart years ago. The porch lights clicked on automatically as darkness fell, casting their shadows against the white siding of the house. Mother and son stood there in the growing night, caught between 2 very different kinds of faith, one in the power of forgiveness, the other in the strength of retribution. The morning sun couldn't pierce the heavy clouds hanging over Ridgeville, matching the town's darkening mood. Outside Betty's diner, now boarded up after nights of protests, 2 groups faced each other across Main Street. One side held signs reading, "Justice for Ethel," while the other displayed, "Everyone makes mistakes." "No peace without justice," the protesters chanted, their voices echoing off storefronts. Pastor John Everett watched from his car, his heart heavy. The incident had split his congregation right down the middle, with some calling for forgiveness and others demanding retribution. He turned his car toward Ethel's house, knowing she might be the only one who could calm these troubled waters. Inside her modest home, Ethel sat in her favorite armchair, reading her well-worn Bible when she heard the knock. "Come in, Pastor," she called out, recognizing his familiar pattern. Pastor Everett entered, removing his hat. "Sister Ethel, I hope I'm not disturbing your morning devotions." "The Lord's word is always enhanced by good company," she smiled, gesturing to the chair across from her. The pastor settled in, his usually confident demeanor showing signs of strain. "Ethel, I've been praying about this situation. The town, it's like a powder keg. People are choosing sides, old friendships are breaking apart. We need your voice at Sunday service." Ethel closed her Bible slowly. "Pastor, you know I prefer to work in quiet ways." "Sometimes the quietest voice is the one people need to hear most," he replied. "Your example of forgiveness, it could show people a better path." Across town, Diesel Washington stood before the burned-out shell of Betty's diner. Someone had thrown Molotov cocktails through the windows 2 nights ago, and the acrid smell of smoke still lingered. Yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze, and plywood covered the broken windows like bandages on wounds. His leather-clad fists clenched as he surveyed the damage. The violence wasn't what his mother would have wanted, but seeing the destruction made his blood boil all over again. This was what happened when people got away with disrespect. Others took it as permission to act out their own hatred. "Getting ideas?" a voice behind him asked. One of his crew members, Snake, stepped up beside him. "Just thinking," Diesel growled. "Thinking ain't gonna solve this, boss. Your mama's too soft on that woman. Sometimes you gotta show people there's consequences." Diesel's jaw tightened. He'd been raised on his mother's teachings about turning the other cheek, but years in the Marines and then the motorcycle club had taught him different lessons about respect and justice. Meanwhile, in the cramped confines of her car, Samantha Reeves tried to comfort her daughter Lily. The 8-year-old hadn't stopped crying since breakfast. "I want to go home, Mommy," Lily whimpered. "I miss my room. I miss my friends." "I know, baby. I know." Samantha stroked her daughter's hair, fighting back her own tears. "We just need to wait a little longer until things calm down." When Lily finally fell asleep, Samantha pulled out her phone. She scrolled through old photos, landing on one that made her heart catch. Her late husband James in his military uniform, smiling that bright smile that had first caught her attention. "Oh, James," she whispered, touching the screen. "What would you say if you could see me now?" His words from years ago echoed in her memory. "Be kind, Sam, even when you're scared. Fear makes us do stupid things, but kindness, that takes real courage." Tears rolled down her cheeks as the truth hit her like a physical blow. She'd been scared of failing at her new job, scared of raising Lily alone, scared of being judged by others. That fear had turned to anger, and that anger had made her lash out at an innocent woman who'd only asked for a clean fork. The realization of her own prejudice and fear-driven actions washed over her like ice water. She'd been so wrapped up in her own struggles that she'd forgotten basic human dignity. The next morning, Ethel woke early, determined to visit Samantha again. Despite Diesel's protests, she set out on foot toward the grocery store parking lot where she knew the young mother and daughter were staying. The morning was unusually warm for spring, and Ethel felt a bit lightheaded as she walked. She'd forgotten to take her heart medication, but she pressed on, feeling that God was pushing her toward this meeting. Halfway there, just past the Methodist church, the world began to spin. Ethel reached for a lamppost but missed, her legs giving way beneath her. The sidewalk rushed up to meet her as darkness crept into the edges of her vision. A passing driver saw her fall and called 911. Within minutes, sirens pierced the morning quiet. Someone had called Diesel too, and the roar of his motorcycle announced his arrival before the ambulance could even load his mother. "Mama!" His voice cracked as he knelt beside her. "Hold on, Mama, please hold on." At the hospital, doctors worked quickly to stabilize her condition. "It's her heart," the physician explained to Diesel. The stress of recent events, combined with missed medication, she needs complete rest. Diesel sat beside his mother's hospital bed, his massive frame looking out of place in the small plastic chair. His calloused hands, more used to working on motorcycles than showing tenderness, trembled as they held his mother's fragile fingers. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I ain't talked to you much since I left home, but Mama never stopped believing in you. So if you're listening, please don't take her. Not like this. Not now." The steady beep of heart monitors filled the silence as nurses moved quietly through the halls. Diesel Washington, feared leader of a Hell's Angels chapter, sat vigil through the morning hours, his prayer continuing in silence as tears rolled unchecked down his weathered cheeks. For the first time in years, the man who solved problems with his fists found himself completely powerless, able only to watch and pray as his mother's life hung in the balance. The morning sun crept across the hospital room floor, marking time as Diesel kept his lonely vigil, his mother's gentle breathing the only sound he cared to hear. The steady beeping of medical equipment filled the quiet hospital room as Ethel Washington slowly opened her eyes. Sunlight streamed through the Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the sterile white sheets. Her gaze fell on Diesel, her son, slumped awkwardly in the too small chair beside her bed. His massive frame seemed incongruous with the peaceful vulnerability of sleep, his leather jacket bunched up as a makeshift pillow. Ethel's heart swelled with love and worry. Even in sleep, his face held tension, the kind a mother recognizes from years of watching her child carry burdens too heavy for their shoulders. "Ricky," she called softly, using his given name. Diesel startled awake, his eyes instantly alert. When he saw his mother conscious and smiling, relief washed over his weathered features. "Mama," he breathed, leaning forward to take her hand. "How you feeling?" "Like I've been reminded I'm not as young as I used to be," Ethel said with a gentle laugh that turned into a small cough. Diesel quickly reached for the water cup with its bent straw, helping her take a sip. His hands, so capable of violence, moved with extraordinary gentleness. "You scared me half to death," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Doc says you need rest. No more walking around town in this heat." Ethel squeezed his hand. "Ricky, I need you to promise me something." His jaw tightened. He knew what was coming. "Mama, promise me you won't harm anyone. Not Samantha, not anybody." Her voice was soft but firm, the same tone she'd used when he was a boy caught fighting at school. Diesel stood up and paced the small room, his boots making muffled sounds on the linoleum floor. "That woman put you in here, Mama. Her actions, her hatred, it led to this." "No, son. My old heart and forgotten medicine put me here. The Lord works in mysterious ways even through our trials." He turned to face her, conflict evident in every line of his body. "I'll promise for now, Mama. But if you die..." His voice caught. "If you die, I can't promise what I'll do." Ethel's eyes filled with tears. "Come here," she beckoned. When he sat back down, she touched his cheek, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. "Hand me my phone, please." Nurse Clara Robinson, who had been quietly checking Ethel's vitals, helped position the phone and adjust the bed so Ethel could sit up comfortably. "What are you doing, Mama?" "Something the Lord is calling me to do," Ethel replied, pressing record. Her face filled the screen, tired but serene, her silver hair framing her face like a halo against the white pillow. "My name is Ethel Washington," she began, her voice clear despite her weakness. "By now, many of you have seen the video of what happened at Betty's Diner. You've chosen sides, pointed fingers, and let anger fill your hearts." She paused, gathering strength. "But I'm here to tell you, I forgive her. I forgive Samantha Reeves completely and without condition." Diesel shifted uncomfortably in his chair as his mother continued. "Don't fight hate with hate. It only breeds more darkness. Instead, let's show what grace looks like. Let's show what love can do. If my old heart can find forgiveness, surely yours can too." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she spoke. "To my son and his friends, your mama loves you, but violence isn't the answer. To those protesting, your energy would be better spent helping someone in need. And to Samantha, child, you're forgiven. Now you need to forgive yourself." When she finished, Nurse Clara, wiping her own eyes, helped her post the video online. "I'll make sure it gets shared," Clara promised, her fingers moving quickly across the phone's screen. Throughout the day, visitors came and went. church members, old nursing colleagues, even the mayor. Each time, Ethel shared her message of peace and forgiveness. By nightfall, her video had spread across social media, touching hearts far beyond Ridgeville's borders. In her car across town, Samantha sat watching the video for the 20th time, her phone's glow illuminating her tear-streaked face. Lily slept in the back seat, clutching her worn, stuffed rabbit. "I forgive her," Ethel's voice repeated from the tiny speaker. "Now you need to forgive yourself." The words broke something inside Samantha. She covered her mouth to muffle her sobs, her whole body shaking with the force of her grief and shame. The truth of her actions, the weight of her prejudice, and the miracle of this woman's forgiveness crashed over her like waves. James's photo smiled up at her from her phone's lock screen. What would he think of her now? The woman who'd let fear turn her cruel, who'd struck an elderly woman over a fork. "I have to make this right," she whispered to his image. "I have to try." The next morning, Samantha woke Lily early. They used the bathroom at the gas station to wash up, and Samantha put extra care into making them both look presentable. "Where are we going, Mommy?" Lily asked, as they walked into the florist shop that had just opened. "To say sorry to someone very special," Samantha replied, selecting a modest bouquet of yellow daisies and white roses. It took nearly all the cash she had left, but some things were worth more than money. The hospital lobby felt impossibly large as they walked in, Lily's small hand clutched tightly in hers. Samantha's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear the receptionist's directions to Ethel's room. As they approached the correct floor, Samantha's steps slowed. Fear crept up her spine. Not of Ethel, but of facing the truth of what she'd done, of standing before this woman whose grace had shamed her pride. They turned the final corner, and there, standing in the hallway like an immovable mountain, was Diesel Washington. His massive arms were crossed over his chest, and his eyes locked onto Samantha with the intensity of a predator. The air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. Lily pressed closer to her mother's side, instinctively sensing the tension. The flowers trembled in Samantha's grip as she stood frozen, caught between the need to make amends and the very real danger radiating from the man before her. Diesel's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck standing out like cords. His fingers flexed against his biceps, and the leather of his jacket creaked with the movement. The hallway seemed to shrink around his presence, and the distance between them felt both too far and not far enough. In the sterile hospital hallway, time seemed to freeze as Diesel's imposing figure blocked Samantha's path. 8-year-old Lily pressed closer to her mother, the yellow daisies and white roses trembling in Samantha's grip. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Diesel's face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. "Please," Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need to see your mother." Diesel's dark eyes narrowed, his massive frame filling the corridor. "You've got some nerve showing up here." "I know," Samantha admitted, unconsciously pulling Lily closer. "But I have to make this right." Before Diesel could respond, a soft voice called from inside the room. "Is that Samantha? Let her in, son." The conflict played across Diesel's features, duty to protect warring with respect for his mother's wishes. Finally, he stepped aside, but his warning was clear in the way he watched their every move. Inside, Ethel lay propped up against white pillows, looking smaller and more fragile than Samantha remembered. The sight brought fresh tears to her eyes. Local news cameras were already set up in the corner of the room, their red lights blinking steadily. Without hesitation, Samantha walked to Ethel's bedside and sank to her knees, the flowers forgotten on the nearby table. Lily stood uncertainly by her side, her small hand still clutching her mother's. "Mrs. Washington," Samantha began, her voice breaking. Child," Ethel interrupted gently. "You don't need to kneel." But Samantha shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "Yes, I do. I was wrong. So terribly wrong." The cameras whirred quietly, capturing every word. "No excuses. I hurt you, and I hurt my daughter by teaching her the wrong way to treat people." Lily squeezed her mother's hand tighter, and Samantha drew strength from the touch. "I let stress and prejudice I didn't even know I had make me into someone I'm ashamed of, someone my late husband would be ashamed of." Through the window to the hallway, faces pressed against the glass, watching the scene unfold. Nurses, doctors, patients, and visitors gathered, drawn by the raw emotion in the room. Ethel's weathered hand reached out, taking Samantha's trembling one. Her touch was warm, gentle, the touch of a mother, a healer. "Child, grace is a hard lesson," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Learn it well." The simple words, heavy with forgiveness, broke something in the watching crowd. Sniffles and quiet sobs filled the air. Even the hardened news cameraman wiped at his eyes with his sleeve. Diesel, standing guard by the door, turned away abruptly. He walked a few steps down the hall, one hand coming up to swipe roughly at his face. The leather of his jacket creaked with the movement. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Samantha said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's exactly why it's called grace, child." Ethel smiled, then looked at Lily. "Come here, sweetheart." Lily approached timidly, and Ethel patted the bed beside her. "Your mom is learning something very important right now. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit when we're wrong and try to make it right." The little girl nodded solemnly, her eyes wide. "Like when I broke Tommy's crayon at school and said sorry?" "Just like that," Ethel chuckled softly. "Only bigger." By evening, the video of their reconciliation had gone viral. Social media lit up with a new headline: "The forgiveness heard around the nation." Comments poured in from across the country, people sharing their own stories of forgiveness and redemption. Ethel dozed peacefully that night, the steady beep of monitors creating a soothing rhythm. But Diesel couldn't find rest. The weight of the day's events pressed down on him, making the hospital chair feel like a cage. At 2:00 in the morning, he stepped outside for some air. The night was warm, crickets chirping in the darkness. He paced the parking lot, his heavy boots scuffing against the asphalt. "Well, well," a harsh voice cut through the night. "If it ain't the softy himself." Diesel turned to find Jake "Snake" Miller, a member of a rival club, leaning against a motorcycle. The man's scarred face twisted in a sneer. "This ain't your territory, Snake," Diesel warned, his hands clenching into fists. "Heard you let that manager walk right into your mama's room," Snake taunted. "Gone soft, Washington. Your colors don't mean much anymore, do they?" Diesel took a step forward, but before he could respond, a distant orange glow caught his attention. Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder by the second. His blood ran cold as he realized the direction of the light: Betty's diner. He sprinted to his bike, the engine roaring to life under him. The 3-minute ride felt like hours. When he arrived, flames were already consuming the boarded-up building. Fire trucks screamed into the parking lot, their red lights painting everything in hellish hues. Spray painted across the remaining wall, barely visible through the smoke, were the words, "For Miss Ethel." Horror and guilt twisted in Diesel's gut as he watched the firefighters battle the blaze. He knew instantly who was responsible: rogue members of various clubs, taking justice into their own hands. Police cars arrived on the scene, and Diesel noticed the officers' suspicious glances in his direction. Before he could process what was happening, news vans began pulling up, reporters already spinning the story. Biker gang leader suspected in diner arson. The fragile peace that had settled over Ridgeville earlier that day crumbled like the charred remains of the diner. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the night as someone threw a bottle at the fire trucks. Shouts began to fill the air as crowds gathered, taking sides once again. Diesel stood in the midst of the chaos, watching helplessly as everything his mother had worked for threatened to go up in flames, just like the diner. The weight of responsibility, both deserved and undeserved, settled heavy on his shoulders as the fire's glow reflected in his eyes. Dawn broke over Ridgeville with a sickly orange glow, the rising sun fighting through lingering smoke that still curled from the blackened skeleton of Betty's diner. The acrid smell of burned wood and melted plastic hung heavy in the morning air. Diesel Washington stood motionless before the ruins, his broad shoulders slumped under his leather jacket. Bits of ash drifted down like dirty snow, settling on his boots and in his graying hair. The diner's twisted metal frame creaked softly in the morning breeze, a haunting reminder of the violence that had erupted in the night. People began gathering at the edges of the yellow police tape, their whispers growing into angry murmurs. Sheriff Dale Cooper moved between the groups, trying to keep the peace, but tension crackled like static before a storm. "You brought this here." A man in a plaid shirt pushed to the front of the crowd, jabbing his finger at Diesel. "You and your biker thugs! This is what happens when we let your kind into our town!" More voices joined in, the accusations flying thick and fast. Diesel stood his ground, his face a mask of stone, though his fists clenched at his sides. Through the hostile crowd came Samantha Reeves, holding tight to 8-year-old Lily's hand. Her face was pale but determined as she moved to stand beside Diesel. Lily clutched her mother's sleeve, her eyes wide at the angry faces surrounding them. "He didn't do this," Samantha's voice rang out clear and strong. "I've been the cause of enough trouble in this town to know what guilt looks like. Diesel Washington has been protecting his mother, not seeking revenge." The crowd fell silent, stunned by her defense of the man many assumed would be her worst enemy. Sheriff Cooper seized the moment of quiet to step forward. "Ma'am's right," he announced, his weathered face serious. "We found evidence this was outside work. Spray paint cans with out-of-state store codes, tire tracks matching bikes not registered in Georgia. This was deliberate provocation by outsiders looking to stir up trouble." The sheriff pulled out his notebook. "Security camera from the gas station caught 3 men in patches from a Nashville club. They're the ones who did this, trying to spark a race war for their own sick entertainment." Inside her hospital room, Ethel Washington watched the morning news coverage of the fire, tears rolling down her weathered cheeks. Nurse Clara Robinson stood beside her bed, holding her hand. "All those years serving food and fellowship," Ethel said softly. "But I'm not crying for the building, Clara. I'm crying for the hearts still hardened by hate, for the souls who think burning and breaking will heal their pain." Clara squeezed her hand. "What will you do now, Miss Ethel?" A gentle smile crossed Ethel's face, even through her tears. "We'll build again. Love always rebuilds. That's what my mama taught me, and her mama before her. Every time hate tears something down, love has to build it back stronger." Heavy footsteps in the doorway made them look up. Diesel filled the frame, his face haunted. "Mama," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll turn myself in if that's what it takes. If it'll help the town heal, I'll tell them I was responsible." "No, son." Ethel's voice was firm as she reached up to touch his cheek, her small hand gentle against his stubbled face. "You'll rebuild instead." Diesel blinked hard, looking down at his mother. "Rebuild?" "That diner was more than just a building," Ethel said. "It was a place where people came together, where differences didn't matter so much over a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. We need that now more than ever." Her fingers traced the worry lines on his face, smoothing them as she had when he was a little boy scared of thunderstorms. "You've got strong hands, son. God gave them to you for building, not destroying. It's time to show this town what those hands can do when they work for love instead of anger." Through the window, sirens wailed in the distance as fire trucks continued to douse hot spots in the diner's remains. But in that quiet hospital room, mother and son held each other's gaze, and something long broken between them began to heal. The next morning, the rumble of motorcycles filled Main Street again. But this time, they came bearing tools instead of threats. Diesel led his crew of 24 bikers, their leather vests dusty in the Georgia sun, straight to the burned diner site. "Time to build, brothers," he called out, his voice carrying across the lot. "Not tear down." Samantha arrived with Pastor Mike and half the First Baptist congregation. She carried work gloves and determination in her eyes. The two groups, bikers and churchgoers, stood awkwardly at first, sizing each other up across the charred remains. "Well," Pastor Mike broke the silence, "Jesus was a carpenter. Guess we better get to work." They started clearing debris, forming human chains to pass burnt timber and twisted metal. Local contractors, moved by the sight, began showing up with supplies. Thompson's Hardware donated lumber. Old Bill from the concrete plant brought materials for the foundation. Lily sat on a nearby bench with 3 children from Ethel's Sunday school class, sharing sandwiches and giggling as they watched the adults work. Their innocent laughter carried across the work site, reminding everyone why they were there. Samantha worked alongside Diesel's crew, hauling debris despite her blistering hands. She refused to stop, even when someone offered to take her place. "I helped break this town," she said, wiping sweat from her face. "I need to help fix it." Hour by hour, more townspeople joined in. The mayor's wife brought lemonade. The high school football team showed up after practice. A black deacon worked beside a white business owner, passing boards and sharing stories. The suspicious stares melted away under shared purpose and summer heat. By late afternoon, the site was cleared. New foundation markers stood ready. The diner's fresh frame began rising against the sunset sky, its beams glowing golden in the fading light. Diesel stepped away from the work site, finding a quiet corner. He knelt in the grass, his massive frame bowed in prayer. "Lord," he whispered, "keep my mama strong enough to see this finished." In her hospital room across town, Ethel watched it all unfold on her tablet through a live Facebook feed someone had set up. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she saw her son leading not in anger, but in healing. Her wrinkled hands clasped together over her heart. "You see, Lord," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You never waste pain. Every broken thing can be made beautiful again in your hands." The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings as Ethel Washington made her way up the newly built ramp to the diner's entrance. Though her steps were slower now, her spirit soared at the sight before her. The parking lot overflowed with cars, motorcycles, and people from every corner of Ridgeville. The gleaming sign above caught the morning light. "Ethel's Table, Everyone Eats," carved in rich oak by Diesel himself. Her son stood tall at the entrance, trading his leather vest for an apron, greeting guests with a warmth that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. Inside, Samantha moved with purpose in her crisp white apron, directing volunteers and checking final preparations. When she spotted Ethel, her eyes welled up. "We're ready," she said, squeezing the older woman's hand. "Everyone's here." Children darted between tables while Diesel's motorcycle crew, now transformed into unlikely waiters, carried trays of steaming food. They'd insisted on serving free meals to veterans, and the elderly first, a touch that made Ethel's heart swell with pride. News cameras rolled as Ethel made her way to the small podium near the counter. The diner fell quiet. She looked out at the faces before her, black and white, young and old, leather-clad and suit-wearing, all gathered as one community. "We cannot fix what we deny," she began, her gentle voice carrying clearly through the room. "And we cannot heal what we hate. But forgiveness can rebuild anything." She paused, touching her heart. "Look around you. This is what love builds." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Music filled the air, old gospel tunes mixing with country songs. Behind Ethel, on the fresh-painted wall, hung a treasured photograph. A young woman standing proudly beside her son in his marine dress blues. The image spoke of faith, service, and endurance. Everything Ethel had taught by example. Samantha watched through tears as families filled the tables, sharing food and laughter, the past's bitter taste replaced by hope's sweet promise. This was more than a diner reopening. It was a town's heart beating whole again. The evening sun had faded to purple twilight when the last customers finally trickled out of Ethel's table. Samantha flipped the sign to "Closed," but left the neon lights glowing. "Open late, love served daily," cast a warm, rose-colored glow across the parking lot. Inside, Ethel settled into her favorite corner booth, the vinyl seat still showing that slight dip where she'd sat for countless Sunday mornings over the years. Diesel slid in across from her, while Samantha and little Lily squeezed in beside them. The diner felt different now in the quiet, peaceful, like a church after service. "Coffee, anyone?" Samantha asked, already rising to fetch the pot. Her movements were easier now, more graceful than those first tense days when she'd started working here. "And bring that apple pie too," Diesel called after her, his deep voice softened by exhaustion and contentment. "Mom always said nothing beats apple pie at midnight." The refrigerator hummed steadily in the background as Lily curled up against Diesel's side, her small hand tracing the eagle tattoo on his forearm. "Uncle Diesel," she said sleepily, "will you tell me another story about when you were a Marine?" "Not tonight, little angel," he chuckled, wrapping one massive arm around her shoulders. "But tomorrow, I promise." Samantha returned with 4 slices of pie and steaming mugs of coffee. As she set them down, tears welled up in her eyes. "Miss Ethel, I don't know how many times I can say thank you, but—" "Child," Ethel interrupted gently, reaching across to squeeze her hand. "Your actions have said more than words ever could." They shared their midnight feast in comfortable silence, broken only by the soft clink of forks against plates and occasional quiet laughter. Through the windows, the neon lights painted everything in a dreamy glow, making even the ordinary scene feel sacred. As the old clock on the wall struck 12, Ethel closed her eyes and bowed her head. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for turning our pain into purpose, our hatred into healing." Outside, the wooden sign swayed slightly in the night breeze. Its carefully carved letters seemed to glow in the moonlight. "Forgiveness is the only revolution that lasts." Below it, the parking lot told its own story of change. Motorcycles parked alongside minivans, pickup trucks beside luxury cars. Just like inside, where bikers shared meals with church ladies, and children played between tables without seeing color or class. The town had been transformed, not by force or fury, but by one simple act of grace that rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Ridgeville would never be the same. It had become something better, something stronger, something whole. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.